I am Britta Petersen. I'm a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation here in Delhi, and today I'm in conversation with Professor David Newman from Israel.
Good afternoon.
Welcome. Professor Newman is the chair for geopolitics at the Department of Politics at the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel, and he's currently a visiting professor at the South Asian University here in Delhi. Welcome again.
Okay, nice to be here.
Israel went to the polls last week and elected a new parliament. And despite this being a very tight race, it seems that Benjamin Netanyahu, the long-term prime minister, is all set to become prime minister again for the fifth time. And that means that he will actually even be longer in power than the legendary founder of Israel, Ben-Gurion. Professor Newman, could we have a look at the results that are here now? Despite the fact that is already 1 week ago, we still don't have a government because both candidates were very tight, close to each other, and a coalition government needs to be formed now. Can you explain us a bit about the different parties and why is Netanyahu so much likely to become again prime minister?
Well, first of all, we never have a coalition government immediately after elections. It always takes a good few weeks for the leader, usually of the largest party, which in this case is again Netanyahu, to bring together a coalition. He has to ensure that he has a minimum of 61 seats in the 120 seat parliament called the Knesset in order to have a majority. And during this week, the leaders of all the parties who have been elected go and visit the president of the state and tell him who they are likely to support. And the president will then, in a week's time, call that leader, which it is pretty clear will be Netanyahu, to put the coalition together. As you can see, there are two large parties. There's the Likud of Netanyahu with 36 and the new centrist party, in Hebrew called Kachol Lavan, blue and white, which is a very patriotic blue and white Israel colors, headed by a former commander-in-chief of the army. In fact, 3 of the 4 top positions in this party have gone to former commanders-in-chief of the army. And he gave him a very close race. He didn't quite make it. But what's much more important than the two parties themselves are looking at all these little satellite parties. And I won't go into each one separately, but there are about approximately 24 of these seats which will go with Netanyahu, and less than 20 that would go in with Kachol Lavan. So in other words, Netanyahu has a much higher probability of putting the coalition government together. In fact, he is the only leader here that has that probability.
Who are the parties that he is going most likely together with?
Well, there are 4 parties that we can see on this list. These two, 8 and 7 together, represent the ultra-Orthodox, very religious population, conservative, and who tend to go in with Netanyahu because they argue he will represent their religious claims stronger than the Labour Party or the opposition these days, who are perceived and portrayed as being secular. And then he has 2 other right-wing parties, the Rightist Union, which is an extreme right-wing party, and also Yisrael Beitenu of the former defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman. There may be little problem there because Yisrael Beitenu is an avowedly secularist party and is against the religious rights. But together, I would assume that Netanyahu and his lawyers will find the right way to bring these 15 and these 10, in other words, 25, will bring them into line, and they'll all have to make some compromises, in return for which they'll all receive ministerial positions around the cabinet table, they'll receive budgets, and that would be a relatively, that would be 61 already. Oh, sorry, and then there's another party, Kulanu, which is also centrist, of the former economics minister, who also veers towards Netanyahu, and so the press reports has already done a deal, or is close to doing a deal, to be in the government and perhaps even receive once again the finance ministry, which of course is a major ministry to receive. So 25 plus 36 would bring him to 61 and another 4 to 65, which in Israeli terms is quite a strong coalition.
We should probably mention that you need 3.2 3.25% if you want to enter the Knesset.
That's right. You need 3.25%, which is approximately 140, 150,000 votes. So there are three parties who came close to this, but just missed out. So you could argue that 400 to 450,000 votes, in a sense, aren't counted. But when you compare to what used to be in Israel, where the lower threshold used to be only 1%, this is significantly higher. And what has happened here is that, had, for instance, I'll give you one example, had, for instance, the New Right gone into a single party with the Rightist Union, and their differences are not so great, then together they could have ended up with about 9 or 10 seats. But small parties tend to fragment over what separates them rather than unite over what joins them together, if they believe they can get over that lower threshold.
Mm-hmm. Benjamin Netanyahu himself is already not a leftist. He is a center-right, if you want to put it mildly. But you have a lot of much more rightist parties now who will form a coalition with him. What will be the price that he has to pay for them to enter?
Well, I think one of the interesting changes that has taken place in Israeli politics over the last 10 years is that, in a sense, the left has moved into the center and the center has moved into the right. And if, say, 8 years ago or so, Netanyahu was seen as being quite an extremist right-winger within his own coalition, today he is even seen and even portrays himself a bit as being of a moderate compared to some of his more right-wing partners. So the price he may have to pay for bringing them in is to stand up very strongly to any form of peace negotiation which comes from the outside. Because the extreme right wing would like to do away with any ideas of two-state solutions and so on. That doesn't mean to say the ultra-Orthodox parties would necessarily oppose that. And then, of course, should there be a peace plan down the road, you never know, say a year down the road and there was a peace plan, he could then possibly call on the other large party who are pro-peace, pro-two-state, to fall in behind him for the sake of peace. But there are obviously prices you have to pay. When you make coalition governments of this nature, you are always prices you have to pay to the smaller parties in order to bring them on board.
Does that also mean that Israel will get more religious?
I think the interesting thing in Israel is that the public street in Israel over the last 20 years has become both more religious and more secular at one and the same time. So that if you go to Jerusalem, for instance, you'll find a very religious Orthodox town. If you go to North Tel Aviv, you'll find a totally secular town. And this has become a very political way of, in a sense, of maneuvering against each other, always raising the spectre of the other imposing their values upon our public street. There is the chance there will be more religious legislation as a result of what is one of the highest representations ever of the ultra-Orthodox parties in the parliament, plus the fact that many of the other right-wing parties, including the Likud, have religious members amongst them.
And on the other side of the political spectrum, the Labour Party was once a proud governing party, but it's only won 6 seats now, so it means that it's almost non-existent anymore as a political factor.
This is the final collapse of the Labour Party. It was the party of David Ben-Gurion, the state founder. It was the party who had hegemonic power in Israel for the first 30 years of the state. And ironically, it's still the party which is portrayed by the majority right as being the party of the European or the Ashkenazi elites who control the press and the media and the justice system. And they've more or less fallen away altogether. It means to say that they really are not in line with what's going on in the street amongst the younger population in Israel, plus the fact, of course, that there were 30% of Israel's population who didn't participate in the elections. And although I don't have the exact figures, I would assume that much of that comes from the left and from the Arab sector, much more than from the right-wing sector.
Leftist parties all over the world are actually facing the same kind of problems at the moment. So I assume that these problems are part of a global crisis of the left. Are there any specific Israeli reasons for the decline?
Yes, I
Labour?
think it is part of the broader dissatisfaction, in a sense, with the left, particularly what I call the intellectual left, part of the milieu with which I live in the world of universities and so on. And I think to a certain extent we live in a very closed world where when we talk amongst ourselves we think that everybody thinks like us, and when we go out of our ivory tower and our gated communities we find that we don't really appeal to the street today and that the street isn't thinking like us. I think the same thing happened in America with the shock of the pro-Trump and anti-Hillary vote. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's similar. And there has been dissatisfaction with the left in Israel over the last 10 years. If at the time of the evacuation of the Gaza Strip, a lot of people were prepared to give a centrist left government a chance to do the same with the West Bank, they are no longer there. They've moved away from that position because they feel that the evacuation of Gaza has been a failure.
Last question. There are also two Arab parties. What is the role of them?
Well, the Arab parties didn't get their act together for this Knesset. There are 3 Arab parties, and normally, and only 2 of them just scraped by the lower threshold. Last time round, the 3 of them ran together, and they had significantly more representation in the Knesset than they will have now. Unfortunately, they're going to have a much lower representation now for 2 reasons. One, they didn't get their act together and go as a single united party to cover their internal differences. And 2, the participation rates amongst the Arab community have been significantly decreasing over the past 10 to 15 years as the Arab/Palestinian community of Israel become more and more dissatisfied with the Israeli body politic.
So that means basically Arab interests are not represented in the Knesset at all?
Well, they are represented. You have here representatives of 2 parties, of Balad, UAL and Hadash-Tal to a lesser extent. So they are represented, but to a much lesser extent than they were in the last Knesset.
And there have been serious allegations of corruption against Benjamin Netanyahu. What are these allegations, and what's going on at the moment with that?
Well, the most amazing thing about these election results is that despite the heightened media attention to the fraud indictments against Netanyahu, he's still come through as the most powerful, or the leader of the largest party. These have become quite serious, and the Attorney General has in fact indicted Prime Minister Netanyahu on 3 counts of potential fraud, which now have to be investigated by police. And many people would say that this election was actually, more than anything else, it was a vote of confidence on Netanyahu's continued role as Prime Minister, both because he's been there so long, 10 years, and because of these fraud indictments. And yet, despite that, he still managed to come through. And it would seem to be that now the continuation of this investigation will take quite some time. It won't be over in a few months. And he will be able to hold out as Prime Minister for as long as he is under investigation, and of course, if he is proved innocent at the end. If at the end of the investigation he is actually put on trial and even proved to be guilty, in that situation he would have to step down as Prime Minister, but until then he will stay in power.
What is he actually being accused of?
Well, he's being accused of giving favours to people close to him, people who have supported his candidacy, things which are not permitted within the wider political framework. Not direct financial fraud as such, but fraud within the wider political question of ethics and criminality. And this raises the whole question of the morality of government. In the past 10 years, you've had both a president and a prime minister and a chief rabbi of Israel who have all been indicted and spent time in prison for different sorts of crimes. And there is a lot of dissatisfaction with what people see as fraudulent behavior and immoral behavior by senior politicians.
Yeah, so thank you very much for listening. This is the first part of our conversation, and I hope that we'll see you again for the second one.